Hello, everybody. My name is Kaveh Safavi with Accenture, and I'm delighted to share with you Accenture's 2021 Digital Health Technology Vision. We do the technology vision every year with the spirit of helping leaders have a sense of where technology is going, knowing full well that the business has to line up with what is possible from a technology perspective. And this year is a particularly interesting year because we've been building on technology advances. And we also had the experience of the COVID pandemic that has squarely affected our view, not only of what technology can do, but what technology should do. And the reason that we titled this presentation, Masters of Change at a Moment of Truth, is a recognition of the fact, an inescapable fact, that our society and our businesses need a level of resilience and adaptability that can only come when you think about the intersection of technology and business in ways that are really fundamental. So as I talk to you about the vision and the 5 concepts that we want to share in 2021, I'll make reference in some cases to the realities that have affected our thinking and why it is shaping the way we're thinking about where technology will take our businesses. To give you a sense of the Accenture technology vision, we've been doing this every year, and what you see here are the 5 trends for the last 3 years and the interconnected nature of them. You'll be able to find all of them on Accenture.com. The way we do our technology vision is a combination of both expert opinion as well as market insights. So we actually survey over 6,000 leaders in all industries globally. 400 of them are healthcare leaders representing 4 continents and about 15 countries. And so there's a mix of both what futurists think as well as what pragmatic business leaders are thinking that go into this technology vision. So what I'm going to share with you today is the technology vision that applies across all of society and all industry, and then reflected specifically in terms that matter to healthcare organizations. And by healthcare organizations, I mean providers and payers, as well as the government and their interests in healthcare, as well as all the other companies and businesses that are seeking to affect health, healthcare, or well-being. The 5 trends we're going to talk about move across the top of the screen there. And you can see, I'll just describe them in brief, and then I'm going to go into detail. Stack strategically, mirrored world, technologist, anywhere, everywhere, and from me to we. And what you'll see is a reflection of a combination of things, a combination of thinking about specific technologies, advanced technologies, as well as business requirements and the way they intersect with each other. And when we talk about technology, we're not just talking about software, we're not just talking about hardware, but we're also talking about data. And that's going to come through really clearly in some of these trends, for example, in the mirrored world. I want to start then with the first one, which is the concept of stacking strategically. And what we mean here by stacking strategically is a recognition that has come through now in all of our research that you really cannot separate business strategy from technology strategy. In this year's survey, 98% of business leaders said that the technology strategy and the business strategies are becoming inseparable. In fact, one of the interesting critical observations that has come through here is that something like 92% of the leaders have said that their ability to succeed is directly related to the technology choices that they make. So they're now starting to think about technology choices as part of business strategy. There are a few specific concepts that I want to stress when we think about this. The first is the concept of the technologies that you invest in. And that includes very modern technologies, digital technologies that we're seeing, for example, cloud computing. What we saw with cloud computing because of the pandemic was that without underlying capabilities that are scalable, the way only cloud computing makes possible, and particularly public cloud computing, businesses simply couldn't respond as quickly to virtualizing their workforce or switching to telemedicine. Most of the telemedicine companies that were in existence at the time of the pandemic were not able to respond instantaneously to the demand for telemedicine because they never anticipated needing to scale their demand that quickly. They all had to invest immediately in replatforming onto a cloud platform that they'll never go back from, because now they have a level of resilience that essentially you really can't function without it. But that's just part of it, is the kind of technology. The other thing that's coming through is your technology partners are actually part of your strategic choice. And that's because, especially if you think about some of these core capabilities like cloud computing, each of the partners that provide cloud computing provide certain competencies or specialization in certain areas that a business might need. And we're seeing increasingly that as companies are making their technology architecture decisions, they're not just focusing on checking the box in terms of capabilities. They're asking the question, what is my partner interested in? What is their view of the world? Where are they pointing their investments to? And are their investments pointed in the same direction that my investments are pointed at, so that I can take advantage of their thinking, their evolution, their roadmap? So you're betting not only on the technology, but the technology partners. That's becoming a bigger part of business decision-making. The last thing that's really coming through here is that in addition to the actual, say, software and hardware, there is this entire concept, and you see this in the bottom left corner of the slide here, of focusing both on trust as a design principle and prioritizing data privacy. We're seeing increasingly that consumers are really asking the question before they engage with anyone on a digital basis: what are you going to do with my information? Can I trust you? Are you going to keep it secure? In fact, we have been looking at digital technology adoption on an every other year basis for a decade. And about 2 years ago, we identified for the first time, and then validated again this year, that the pace of adoption by consumers and citizens of digital healthcare technologies, and that includes things like wearables, the use of applications, the use of telemedicine, essentially has plateaued over the past 4 years. And the primary reason it's plateauing is the issue of trust. 37% of consumers say that the reason they don't use digital health capabilities or digital any kind of digital technologies is their concern about who has their information and how they're going to use it. So what we're telling organizations is, as you build your business around technology, recognize that trust from your employees, trust from your stakeholders, is something you actually have to be affirmative about. You cannot take it for granted, because if you do, you run the risk that people are simply not going to use your capabilities, or limit the use of your capabilities because they don't trust what you're going to do with it. And that goes not just to data privacy, but it goes to concepts like, are you going to use my information in a way that's consistent with my intent? I say that because what you're seeing increasingly is consumers are saying, forget the fine print and making me check the fine print. If you're using an information that I give you in a way that's inconsistent with what you should understand is my intent, then I'm not going to be happy with that, and I'm not going to participate or engage with you. And that's a really critical concept. So this idea that your technology decisions are your business decisions and they're inseparable is a really, really critical part of this first decision point, of this first trend. The second trend is what we call the mirrored world. And we talk about this as really a recognition that we are now entering into the era of digital twins. And by digital twins, what I really mean is trying to replicate the current physical environment in a way that allows us to test, to simulate, to learn without actually having to do it in a physical environment. Now, we're familiar with digital twins. It's been talked about in areas like manufacturing, where people have replicated the shop floor, or certain product innovations like automobiles, where they're essentially building out and then replicating something physical and then trying to figure out what the effects are on changes. What's critical about that example is that digital twins are not about software. They're actually about data. It's not a software problem, it's a data problem. And for health, if we want to really enter into the world of digital twins, we have to start by recognizing that we need to collect essentially the digital activity or digital identity of everything we do. And that is far more significant and far more inclusive than clinical data or electronic health record data. Clinical and electronic health record data really present a very small slice of what you would need to create a digital twin. We're seeing, for example, that in clinical research, you have omic, genomic, and other kinds of omic information. People are trying to essentially replicate basic research on a computer chip rather than having to go through the trial and error process in a cellular form, so they can get to animal and they can get to human much faster. In healthcare delivery, we're starting to see this around experiences. There are a number of children's hospitals that have recognized, for example, that to deal with the anxiety that a young patient has coming in for a test or a procedure, what you really need to do is allow them in a virtual exposure to actually see what it's going to be like to be admitted to the hospital, to have a procedure done, to go through recovery. And to do that, you actually have to have information about location, you have to have information about the rooms, far more than the clinical activity, to essentially create a virtual example for a patient or a family member to go through. The third area that we're beginning to see is people trying to replicate business processes with the idea that they can test whether multiple changes in a business process will get a better outcome. Again, to do that, you have to have enough information about that business process to really replicate a three-dimensional view of what happens, and then go in and alter something. So what's really becoming clear here is digital twin is going to be a critical way for businesses to innovate, experiment, and learn. Digital twins are highly dependent on data foundations, even more than software, and therefore thinking about everything you do and the data it creates, capturing it and reusing it is critical. And then the last is that in healthcare, digital twins can be used not just for clinical discovery or learning, but for operational and experiential kinds of work. So it has utility across all of the parts of our healthcare business. The third trend is something we call iTechnologist, also subtitled The Democratization of Technology. And this is a recognition that we are now entering into a world of what we'll call no-code or low-code capabilities that are allowing us the ability to let non-technology business users actually engage and manipulate technologies in ways that have never been done before. We saw this happening during the period of COVID, for example, and I'll give you a specific example of that. But what really is happening here is a recognition that you can't be competent in the modern workforce if you don't really understand technology beyond a very superficial level, because it's too much a part of work. That doesn't mean, as the bottom bullet says, turning everyone into an engineer, but it does require them to think like technologists. We often talk about why our young people need how to learn to code, no matter what discipline they want to study. And the reason we say that is because if they don't understand how to code, they don't understand the concept of what a digital application is that they might use in publishing or in communications or in whatever their given field is. And that this concept of literacy is so critical for the modern worker. In fact, 84% of our surveyed respondents, senior executives, said they have to train their people to use this technology at an individual level. So during the pandemic, for example, what we saw were clinical units that were in a situation where they had to immediately figure out how to redeploy people and protective equipment. And they did not have time to go to their IT organization, and they did not have the time to go out to market and procure technology that they would use to optimize their workflow. And we started to see line staff, doctors, nurses, clerks, using software that their organizations had that are essentially no code or low code environments, and building their own, essentially their own workflow tools on the fly for the rules that were necessary for the problems that they were going to solve. This is a really interesting evolution, this idea that business people are actually going to manipulate the technology to create a capability rather than asking for the information to be brought to them. We went through this a decade ago around business information and business intelligence. And you might recall 10, 20 years ago, a business leader sent in a request for a report, and a group of people in the basement generated the report. And now we have a whole series of business intelligence tools that allow leaders to get direct access to the information that they need to make decisions, whether it's in their CRM or their ERP process. This is moving beyond the data to the actual tools that are transactional tools that allow them to actually change and influence the work processes directly. So the way this evolves is really about a combination of things. The first is you have to start small. So think about this as an experimental process where you're going to begin to learn how to do this in critical environments. And our experience is that the back office is a much safer place to do it than the bedside because of all of the issues around safety. And look at what tools you have in the back office to see whether or not those are actually useful. The second point is really critical, which is investing in technology literacy. I'll give you an example. One of the things that Accenture does, now we advise people on business and technology, but we have lots of people in our organization that aren't on the front lines of providing advice. We have 600,000 employees, and we require all of our employees to actually test off in 7 different categories of technology. And there's essentially a pre-test, and then if you don't pass the pre-test, you take the course, which is really, they're fantastic courses, and then you go back and test again. But if you don't pass on those scores, you have to keep doing it. And the reason we say that is we want everybody in our organization to have 1 or 2 clicks below the superficial label around capabilities like cloud computing, or like artificial intelligence, or like even blockchain, so that they understand what we do for our clients and how we advise them in something that in a level that's more meaningful than just the headline. And that means that you're moving the literacy up of your entire workforce. And the last one is the way you actually support this. And what we find typically is that it's best done if you take essentially a team of peer voluntary leaders that are actually working with individual groups of the line to help them come up to speed and give them examples of how to do this using some of these new platforms. This is a evolving area, but we think it is without question the destination. And so what we're really saying now is recognize the end and begin to make the investments, because the world is going to move in that direction one way or another. The fourth trend is a concept we call anywhere, everywhere, also known as bring your own environment. And this is an interesting evolution. This is an evolution from what we used to talk about, which is bring your own device, which was largely about things like I can do my email on my phone, to this idea that I have to actually be able to do my work wherever I'm at. And this was really amplified during COVID. What we found during COVID was that while it's fine for you to be able to look at your email, if you want to do your work, you have to have access to data sources that maybe you don't have access to unless you're inside the 4 walls of the business. So you have privacy and security concerns that might come up. It might be that there are applications that we haven't made available to you unless you're inside the 4 walls of our business process, and if we're a business location. And if we're really intent on giving people the ability to work from anywhere, work from home, we actually have to make the full, complete capabilities of what happens in our 4 walls available everywhere else. So when we talk about anywhere, everywhere, and bring your own environment, we're talking about data, we're talking about software, sometimes we're talking about hardware, many times, and we're always talking about security. All of these characteristics go into bringing your environment. And it's a recognition increasingly that employees are going to expect to work from wherever they're at. Our research on where workforce is going to land in terms of hybrid tells us that less than 20% of employees want to work in a full either on-premise environment or a full virtual. Everybody wants to work in a hybrid environment. Over 80% want to work in a hybrid environment. Now that'll play itself out as to what days, but the truth is any form of a hybrid environment requires this level of flexibility. So we are entering into this world of bring your own environment with the idea that people are going I'm sorry about that. People are going to increasingly insist on work flexibility wherever they're at. There's some other interesting things that are coming out, and you're beginning to see this now in terms of space. Concepts like thinking about space in a three-dimensional way using extended reality. We recently conducted an event, a technology challenge that's normally done in a creative space. And we tried to use our virtual reality capabilities to replicate not just the work, but the environment that the work was being done in, because that is part of the creative process. So you see how this can go pretty significantly if you start to get into the full sense of what's possible. The last concept here is that from a talent perspective, you're going to start to begin to look at people who are trying to balance business capabilities and technology capabilities in their workforce, and they might choose to recruit from talent pools that are not typical talent pools because they're trying to augment the technology quotient or the technology capabilities of the workforce they're bringing in. So this has many implications besides just the IT implications. The last trend, and one that might feel not very accessible, but it's quite important, is what we call from me to we, or the concept of a multi-party system. And a multi-party system is really a reflection of activities, transactions, work that needs to be done, where multiple parties have to rely on each other, but they don't have the ability to go to a single source of truth in a trusted way. And yet they have to act on a common set of information. So the best example during the pandemic of where this was showing up in health is sitting around the concept of a vaccine passport. Every country has its own theory of whether you can enter a country or have to go through quarantine or have to get COVID tested. But every country relies on knowing something about the status of the person entering or crossing that border. And there is no single repository for vaccine information that's known as the single source of truth, right? Every country or jurisdiction might have its own repository, but every other country needs to rely on that. It's not like we're going to send it to one third party, a third party is going to validate it, and then you go to the third party to get information. We all have to share with each other in a low trust environment the information so that we can act on it in at least in a reliable way. These multi-party systems have actually been developed around digital currency for some time, going back to the issue of currency across borders. And something that many of you know, why is it that you can move money from one bank in the US to another bank instantaneously, but can't move money from a US bank to a European bank instantaneously and online, and you have to go through a wire transfer? And that's because there is an actual point where that digital relationship falls into an analog process when we're doing essentially this idea of currency exchanges across borders. Now, we all know from a practical perspective, there's no reason why that can't be done digitally. But for that to happen, we have to create alternatives to the trust environment that we're working in. And most of the advanced thinking around multi-party platforms has largely been around currency. But the movement toward healthcare is really critical too, because it allows a shared data infrastructure between organizations with no trust or low trust. Now, that doesn't necessarily, that concept, which is called a distributed ledger, actually a multi-party platform, relies on a type of technology that's called distributed ledger. And one example of distributed ledger is blockchain, but this is not synonymous with blockchain. Blockchain is merely one technical expression of a way to solve a multi-party platform. And our view is that rather than thinking about this as about blockchain, you have to go to a much higher order question, which is multi-party, and then decide which technology solves the problem of a multi-party system that you really that you need to deal with. This area is going to increasingly become important for healthcare beyond COVID and the pandemic. We're going to see it in areas like supply chain and validation of authenticity of products, particularly as they move around the globe. But it gives you an illustration of the fact that this idea that everything can sit in a repository and be validated by a single authority is just not realistic for the kind of work we do. So from what the end state looks like, or how you get to the end state, what we talk about right now is you recognize it, you begin to ask some of your people to think about multi-party platforms that actually apply in healthcare. You focus on the learning, and you focus on some of the early adoption. So joining industry consortiums working with expert companies that are actually advanced in multi-party platform is a critical part of bringing your competencies up while we see the adoption of the multi-party platforms spread. So we've covered 5 concepts right now. And I think you see from that every one of these 5 concepts is really a representation of technologies and problems that pre-existed and then got amplified by the impact of COVID and the pandemic. And I think what that tells us in net is that the pandemic and COVID didn't really introduce new technologies or capabilities in the conversation. What it did is it heightened the sense of urgency and the criticality of technology and business working together, because it put problems on the table that simply could not be solved alone through traditional ways of doing work. And while we all know and all hope that we're going to roll back from the crisis stage of the current COVID pandemic, I think we can all also appreciate the fact that whether it's a pandemic or some other crisis, the likelihood of a business to have to respond to stressors that are more than just within the normal tolerance of business, but unexpected or unforeseen circumstances, the need for resilience increases an organization's requirement for their understanding of where technology is going as part of their process of building a viable, vibrant, resilient business. So let me close by saying that this full report is available at Accenture.com. And if you actually look, you can look back at previous years and see the path. But if you just read the current year, you'll see the references to previous years. Brian and I are the authors, and both of us are happy to address any issues. But as you look at the sources there, I'm sure you're going to think of your own examples. And what I would encourage all of you to do is to think about these trends and think about the ones that are the closest to you in terms of your day job and what you do, and ask the question, if I just look down the road a little bit, where is this going? And what should I start to do differently in order to be able to reach that destination? With that, I thank you very much for your time and attention. I hope you found this useful, and I look forward to having a chance to encounter some of you or many of you on the road as I travel around and work with various healthcare systems and payers. Thanks a lot and have a great day.